Texas, 1943. The cattle cars rolled into Fort Worth under a sky the color of bleached bone, carrying men who had crossed an ocean in chains only to find themselves deposited in a landscape stranger than any battlefield. Heinrich Müller pressed his face against the wooden slats and saw nothing but flatness. Miles of wheat stubble stretching toward a horizon that seemed to swallow the earth whole. He had been told Americans were wasteful, soft, corrupt. He had been told their farms were mechanized monstrosities that poisoned the soil. He had been told many things. None of them prepared him for what he was about to see. The doors opened. Heat rushed in like a living thing. Camp Concordia sprawled across the Kansas prairie like a small city built from dust and wire, housing over 4,000 German prisoners by the autumn of 1943. But Heinrich and his unit, 37 men captured after Kasserine Pass, were headed 60 miles east, to a smaller facility where the fences were lower and the work was endless. They had been farmers before the war, most of them, pulled from the Rhineland and Bavaria to fight in North Africa. Now they stood on American soil, blinking against the glare, while guards with easy grins and strange accents loaded them onto trucks that smelled of diesel and hay. The camp commander was a man named Captain William Thornton, 46 years old, a veteran of the First War who walked with a limp and spoke German with a Bavarian accent he'd learned from his grandmother. He stood at the gate as the trucks arrived, watching the prisoners file out with their hollow eyes and threadbare uniforms, and he thought about his own father's wheat farm outside Salina, about the way the land demanded respect regardless of what flag you flew. "You folks will be working the fields," he told them through an interpreter, though some understood English well enough. "Harvesting, planting, fixing what needs fixing. You'll be fed, you'll be housed, and you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Any questions?" Heinrich raised his hand. He was 24, broad-shouldered despite months of poor rations, with eyes the color of winter slate. "What about the food?" he asked in careful English. "We have heard things." Thornton studied him. "Heard what things?" "That American food is not real, made in factories, poison perhaps." A few guards laughed, but Thornton silenced them with a look. He understood. He had seen the propaganda leaflets the Germans distributed, the ones claiming America was a nation of synthetic everything. Rubber, fuel, even food. The Nazis had spent years convincing their soldiers that the United States was a decadent empire built on lies and chemicals, that nothing here could be trusted. "Tell you what," Thornton said, "you don't have to eat a damn thing you don't want to, but you're going to see where it comes from first." The prisoners were led to their barracks, long wooden structures with iron beds and thin mattresses that felt like heaven after the North African sand. They were given clean uniforms, plain gray with PW stenciled on the back, and told dinner would be served at 6. When the time came, most of them filed into the mess hall with the wary expressions of men approaching a trap. The food was simple. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread still warm from the oven, butter in small yellow squares, coffee, real coffee, steaming in white ceramic mugs. The smell alone was enough to make several prisoners stop in their tracks. Heinrich took his tray and sat. He looked at the beef, thick slices, pink in the middle, juice pooling around the potatoes. He thought about the pamphlets they had been given on the ship from Casablanca, the ones warning that Americans fed their prisoners laboratory meat, chemicals disguised as nutrition. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Heidelberg, about the smell of Sunday sauerbraten, about the impossibility of this moment. He didn't eat. Neither did most of the others. They sat there, 37 men staring at full plates while guards watched from the corners, confused. One prisoner, a boy named Klaus who couldn't have been older than 19, picked up his fork and then set it down again, hands trembling. Another, Otto, a dairy farmer from outside Munich, pushed his tray away entirely. "What's the problem?" a guard asked, approaching their table. "We do not know what this is," Heinrich said quietly. "Where it comes from." The guard, a corporal named Jimmy Reeves, 22 years old, from a ranch outside Abilene, scratched his head. "It's beef, buddy, from a cow. Potatoes from the ground, same as anywhere." We have been told American agriculture is not natural. Jimmy blinked. Then he laughed, not unkindly. Hell, you think we're feeding you space food or something? This here's from the ranch down the road. Old man Carson's place. He's been raising cattle since before my daddy was born. Heinrich didn't laugh. We cannot eat what we do not understand. That night, Captain Thornton sat in his office reading the mess hall report. 0 meals consumed by the new arrivals. He lit a cigarette and thought about the problem. These men weren't being defiant. They were terrified. Years of propaganda had convinced them that America was something alien, that the very food grown from American soil might be contaminated, unnatural, dangerous. He stubbed out the cigarette and picked up the phone. "Get me Jack Carson," he said. Jack Carson was 63 years old, leather-faced and lean, with hands that could gentle a skittish horse or mend a fence post with equal ease. He had been ranching in Kansas since 1903, back when the land was still half wild and the winters could kill you if you weren't careful. He wore his hat at an angle that suggested he had never taken an order from anyone in his life, and when Thornton explained the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "They think the food's poison," he finally said. "Something like that. Nazi propaganda convinced them we grow everything in factories." Jack made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Factories, Jesus." He paused. "You want me to show them how it's really done?" "If you're willing." "When do we start?" The next morning, before dawn, Heinrich and the others were roused from sleep by guards who seemed almost cheerful. They were loaded onto trucks again, but this time they drove only 20 minutes, across dirt roads flanked by wheat fields that glowed gold in the early light. The truck stopped at a gate marked with a weathered sign, Carson Ranch, established 1903. Jack Carson stood waiting, one boot propped on a fence rail, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. Behind him, the ranch spread out like something from a storybook. Red barn, white farmhouse, corrals where horses stood watching with liquid eyes. And beyond all that, pastures where cattle grazed under the endless Kansas sky. "Morning," Jack said, tipping his hat. He spoke no German, and he didn't try. "Hear you boys don't trust American food. Can't say I blame you. I wouldn't trust anything I didn't see grow myself. So that's what we're going to do. You're going to see." Through an interpreter, the message reached them. Heinrich felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't name it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint, dangerous hope that something he'd been told might be a lie. Jack led them to the wheat fields first. The harvest was mostly done, but stubble remained, golden and sharp, crackling under their boots. He knelt and dug his fingers into the soil, coming up with a handful of dark earth that crumbled like cake. "This land's been in my family 40 years, he said. "My father broke it with a plow and 2 mules, no factories, no chemicals, just seed, sun, water, and time. You put wheat in the ground in September, and if you're lucky, you pull it out in June. Same as it's been done for 10,000 years. He let the soil fall through his fingers. That's what made your bread last night. Wheat from this field, ground at the mill in town, baked by a woman named Martha who's been making bread since 1925. Nothing fake about it." The interpreter translated. Heinrich stared at the stubble, at the vastness of the field, at the simplicity of what Jack was saying. It was so obvious it felt like a trick, but the earth under his own boots felt real. The smell of chaff and dust felt real. They moved to the cattle next. Jack led them to a pasture where 50 head of Herefords grazed, their red coats bright against the prairie grass. He pointed to a cow, a massive animal with gentle eyes chewing cud in the morning sun. "That's Bessie," he said. "She's 7 years old, born right here on this ranch, fed on grass you can see growing under her feet. When she's ready, she'll be butchered humanely, and her meat will feed people for months. The beef you were served last night came from her sister, Clara, who lived a good life eating grass and drinking from that creek over there." He gestured toward a line of cottonwoods where water glinted silver. "No factories, no chemicals, just cattle doing what cattle do." Otto, the dairy farmer, spoke for the first time. "How much land do you have?" Jack smiled. 1,200 acres, about half in wheat, the rest for grazing. My grandfather would have called that a small farm back in the day. 1,200, Otto trailed off. In Bavaria, his family's dairy had been 20 acres, passed down for generations. 1,200 seemed impossible. America's a big country, Jack said, reading his expression. Lot of space, lot of sky. We grow what we need and then some. They spent the morning walking the ranch. Jack showed them the chicken coops where hens scratched and clucked, producing eggs by the dozen. He showed them the vegetable garden behind the farmhouse, where his wife Mary had planted tomatoes, beans, carrots, and squash in neat rows that stretched toward the horizon. He showed them the root cellar, cool and dark, lined with jars of preserves and canned goods, each one labeled in Mary's careful hand. "This is how Americans eat," Jack said. "Off the land. Same as you did before the war, I reckon." By noon, the prisoners were sitting in the shade of the barn, drinking water from a pump that pulled cold and clean from deep underground. Jack brought out sandwiches, thick slices of bread with ham and cheese, and set them on a wooden table. "Bread from my wheat," he said. "Ham from a hog I raised. Cheese from the dairy 10 miles south. You don't have to eat it, but it's real, and it's yours if you want it." Heinrich picked up a sandwich. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over in his hands. Then he took a bite. The taste was simple: salt, smoke, the slight tang of mustard. The bread had a texture that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, of Sunday mornings before the world burned. He chewed slowly, aware that the other prisoners were watching him, aware that something fundamental was shifting in the architecture of what he believed. It was just food, real, honest food. One by one, the others began to eat. That evening, back at the camp, the mess hall served the same meal as the night before: roast beef, potatoes, green beans, bread. This time, the plates were emptied. Heinrich sat with Otto and Klaus eating in silence, thinking about the wheat stubble under his boots, about Bessie, the cow chewing grass in the sun, about the way Jack Carson's hands had crumbled soil like it was something sacred. "They lied to us," Klaus said quietly, staring at his empty plate. "About everything," Otto agreed. Heinrich didn't respond. He was thinking about the propaganda, about the years of being told that America was decadent, corrupt, that its people were soft and its land poisoned by industry. He was thinking about how easy it had been to believe and how hard it was to unbelieve. Over the following weeks, the prisoners worked the fields around the camp, harvesting late corn and preparing the ground for winter wheat. They worked alongside local farmers, men like Jack Carson, weathered and practical, who treated them not as enemies but as labor, as men with hands who knew how to use them. They learned the rhythms of American agriculture, the machinery and methods, the sheer scale of production that fed a nation while supplying its armies overseas. But more than that, they learned the disconnect between what they had been told and what was true. One afternoon, Heinrich found himself working next to a farmer named Tom Whitaker, a man in his 50s with a face like carved wood and a dry sense of humor. They were mending a fence, driving posts into hard ground, when Tom offered him a cigarette. "You smoke?" Tom asked. "Sometimes," Heinrich said, accepting. They stood in silence for a moment, smoking and watching the clouds drift across the immense Kansas sky. Then Tom said, "You know, I had a cousin who fought in the First War. Over in France. He said the German boys he met were just like us, farmers mostly, who wanted to go home." Heinrich didn't know what to say to that. "Guess some things don't change," Tom continued. "Politicians start wars and farmers fight them. Then we all go back to the dirt." "In Germany," Heinrich said slowly, "we were told Americans hated us, that you would treat us like animals." Tom shrugged. "Some might. People are people. There's good and bad everywhere. But most of us figure you didn't ask to be here any more than our boys asked to be over there." He stubbed out his cigarette. "Besides, soil don't care what flag you fly. Work's work." That night, Heinrich wrote a letter to his mother, though he knew it would be censored and might never arrive. He told her about the ranch, about the wheat fields and the cattle, about the way the sky here seemed to go on forever. He told her about Jack Carson and Tom Whitaker, about the simple fact that American farmers were just farmers, Same as anywhere, bound to the land by the same ancient contract of seed and season. He didn't tell her that everything the Reich had said was a lie, but he suspected she might read between the lines. By December, the camp had settled into a routine. The prisoners worked during the day and studied English at night, some with genuine interest, others simply to pass the time. The mess hall no longer served as a test of faith. The food was eaten without hesitation, and some prisoners even began requesting seconds. The guards, for their part, grew less vigilant, recognizing that men who understood where their next meal came from were less likely to cause trouble. Jack Carson visited the camp once a week, ostensibly to check on the farm work, but really to see how the prisoners were adjusting. He brought his wife Mary sometimes, a woman with silver hair and a warm laugh who baked pies that made grown men weep. She treated the prisoners like nephews, asking about their families, teaching them English phrases, correcting their grammar with gentle patience. "You boys need to write home more," she told them one afternoon, standing in the mess hall with a stack of stationery and envelopes. "Your mothers are worried sick, I guarantee it." Otto, who had developed a habit of following Mary around like a lost dog, nodded seriously. "Yes, Mrs. Carson, I write every week." "Good. And what do you tell her?" "That the food is good, that the work is hard but fair, that the Americans are not what we expected." Mary patted his shoulder. "That's a good boy. Now help me carry these pies." The transformation wasn't universal. A few prisoners remained suspicious, clinging to the ideology they'd been raised in, insisting that American kindness was a trick, a way to weaken their resolve. But they were the minority, and as the months passed, even they began to soften around the edges, worn down by the relentless ordinariness of life on the Kansas prairie. Heinrich found himself thinking less about the war and more about the land. He had grown up on a small farm outside Heidelberg working alongside his father until the Reich had come calling, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be connected to the earth to see the direct result of your labor in the form of crops harvested and animals raised. Here, despite the wire fences and guard towers, despite the fact that he was thousands of miles from home and technically a prisoner, he felt closer to that old life than he had in years. One evening in late January, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink that painted the entire sky, Jack Carson brought Heinrich and a few others back to the ranch. He wanted their help with a difficult calving. Bessie was in labor, and it wasn't going well. They worked through the night, Jack giving quiet instructions, Heinrich and Otto holding the cow steady while Jack reached in with steady hands and guided the calf free. It was a slow, tense process, and when the calf finally emerged, slick and trembling, there was a moment of absolute silence in the barn. Then the calf took its first breath, and Bessie lowed softly, and something in Heinrich's chest cracked open. He realized he was crying. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the sheer life-and-death rawness of what they'd just done, or the fact that he had spent years being trained to destroy, and here he was helping something be born. Maybe it was all of it. Jack handed him a towel. "Welcome to ranching," he said quietly. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Heinrich and many of the others had been transferred to other camps, part of the vast machinery of repatriation and resettlement. But before he left Kansas, Heinrich made one last visit to the Carson ranch. He found Jack in the barn, mending harness leather, and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," Heinrich said in English that had improved considerably, "for showing us the truth." Jack looked up. "Truth about what?" "About America, about farming, about—" Heinrich struggled for the words. "About how things really are." Jack set down the leather and stood. He was quiet for a moment, studying the young German with the serious eyes. Then he extended his hand. "You did the work," he said. "That's all any man can do. Work the land, treat it fair, and maybe leave it a little better than you found it." He paused. "You ever make it back to Germany, you remember that. Soil's the same everywhere. Just needs good hands." They shook. Heinrich felt the calluses on Jack's palm, the strength in the grip, and thought about all the propaganda that had tried to convince him this man was his enemy. It seemed absurd now, Impossible. I will remember, Heinrich said. He did. Years later, after repatriation, after returning to a Germany shattered and remade, after rebuilding his family's farm from ruins, Heinrich Müller would tell his children about the American cowboy who defeated the Reich's lies with nothing more than dirt and honesty. He would tell them about wheat fields under endless skies, about cattle grazing in the sun, about the simple truth that food comes from the earth, not from factories or propaganda, and that the men who work that earth are bound by something older and more fundamental than any political ideology. He would tell them that sometimes the most radical act of resistance is simply showing someone the truth. And he would tell them about the day he learned that he had been lied to about almost everything, except the part about the soil. The soil, at least, was honest. The sky over Kansas was still endless. The wheat still grew in its season. And somewhere in the great turning of history, a handful of German prisoners learned that the enemy wasn't quite what they'd been told, and that understanding came not from speeches or ideology, but from the simple act of watching food grow from the ground. Captain Thornton kept records of the camp's operations, and his reports noted a marked decrease in disciplinary incidents after the prisoners began working the surrounding farms. He attributed this to practical education in American agricultural methods, but his private diary, discovered decades later by his granddaughter, told a different story. The German boys are starting to understand that we're not so different. They see how we work the land, how we treat our animals, how we live our lives, and they realize everything they were told was designed to make them hate us. Fear is powerful, but it's no match for a man standing in a wheat field holding soil in his hands. You can't maintain that kind of propaganda when the evidence against it is literally under your feet. I think we're winning a different kind of war here, one meal at a time. He was right. Of the thousands of German POWs who worked American farms during the war, many returned to Germany with stories that contradicted everything the Nazi regime had taught them. Some wrote books. Others simply told their families, passing down oral histories of American farmland and the people who worked it. A few, like Heinrich, even returned to America years later, bringing their children to see the places where they'd learned that their enemies were just men like themselves. Jack Carson died in 1967 at the age of 87, still working his ranch until the cancer finally made it impossible. At his funeral, the pastor mentioned that he'd received letters from Germany over the years, from men who remembered his kindness during the war. Some of those letters were from prisoners. Some were from their children, writing to thank the man who had shown their fathers that the world was bigger and more complex than any propaganda could capture. Mary Carson kept those letters in a box under her bed. She reread them sometimes, especially the one from Heinrich, who had become a successful farmer in Bavaria and who wrote every year until his death in 1989. His last letter, written a few months before he passed, said simply, "I think of your wheat fields often. I think of your husband's hands in the soil. I think of the night the calf was born. These are the memories that sustain me. Thank you for teaching me how to see clearly." The camp itself was decommissioned after the war and eventually dismantled. The land returned to farming. If you drive through Kansas today, you might pass the spot without knowing it. Just another stretch of prairie where wheat grows and cattle graze, where the sky still seems endless, and the soil still crumbles in your hand like it always has. But for a few years in the 1940s, that land was a battlefield of a different kind, where the weapon was truth, and the victory was measured not in territory gained, but in minds changed. Where German prisoners arrived expecting poison and found only food. Where cowboys and farmers defeated the Reich's propaganda with nothing more than patience, dirt, and the willingness to show others how things really grew. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't end the war, but it mattered. And for the men who experienced it, who stood in those wheat fields and watched the sun rise over a landscape that seemed to stretch into infinity, it was the moment they understood that everything they'd been told about their enemies was wrong. The soil didn't lie. The food was real. And the man who showed them the truth wore a cowboy hat and spoke with a Kansas drawl and didn't care one bit about politics or ideology. He only cared about the land, and about passing on what he knew to anyone willing to learn. That, in the end, was the greatest act of resistance imaginable.